Welcome to Trita Parsi, the Executive Vice President at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Hi, Trita.
How's it going?
Oh, not bad. We're talking about these analysts. We're hearing from plenty of analysts and even Iran's president who are warning that Israel is already looking to the next Israel-Iran war. But you've coupled that prediction with a date. What do you see as coming?
Well, I think, first of all, I think it's critical to understand that from the Israeli standpoint and their calculations, many of their key aims in the previous war were not achieved. But having started the effort towards achieving them, it would be, from the Israeli standpoint, dangerous to stop at this point. And what I'm pointing to is that the Israelis ultimately want to make sure that they subdue Iran, turn it into the next Syria, a country that Israel can bomb at will, with impunity, and without American involvement. That is not the case currently with Iran. And from there on, they continue with the strategy called mowing the grass, which is every year or so they keep on bombing just to make sure that the country doesn't have the capability of challenging Israel or even having a deterrence against Israel. Now, having started this, it's very dangerous from the Israeli standpoint to stop, given the fact that if they stop, they give the Iranians time to rebuild their air defense systems, perhaps even buying better ones, and by that make it much more difficult for the Israelis to do this. I mean, the only reason they actually decided to do this, or one of the key reasons, is because of the weakening of the axis of resistance and the strikes that they had against Iran earlier on that took out many of their air defense systems. That created an opening. If that opening closes, the strategy essentially falls apart. So they're under time pressure for this. Now, I think that once you reach December, the US is going to enter its midterm election season. At that point, the combination of giving Iran too much time and the much more messy situation in the US, not necessarily prohibitive, but something that makes it more complicated for the Israelis to go down that path, because they need America's involvement. They cannot do this without the United States. Makes it such that it seems to me much more likely that this will happen before then. Now, of course, if the Europeans snap back sanctions on Iran at the UN by the end of this month, that will create a political opening for the Israelis to do it. Not to say that they need it. They didn't need it in the previous. In fact, they were planning to do the first attack in February without any of these type of measures. But it can create a bit of an opening that may actually prompt the attack to take place sooner rather than later.
Turning Iran into the next Syria, mowing the grass, these aren't the sort of justifications that would fly with the UN, with the international community. What, from the point of Israel, could they claim as a pretext for a new conflict?
Well, first of all, the Israelis are doing that in Lebanon, they're doing that in Syria, and of course they're engaged in a genocide in Gaza, which, the vast majority of the international community seems to be against, but because of continued support from the US and much of Europe, the Israelis are continuing to do this without much consequences, at least not so far. When it comes to Iran, I think what you will see is that there will be some attempts to give a justification for this, either because of the snapback, and the snapback will reinstate UN resolutions that will call on Iran to cease all enrichment, go back to zero enrichment. The fact that we don't know yet exactly where the 400 kilos or 800 kilos of 60% enriched uranium is. The Israelis have already started saying that the Iranians are restarting enrichment, or that they're doing something with that stockpile. So there is a plethora of various arguments that they will be using, none of them necessarily justifying war. In fact, none of the things that have happened before justify this action, which will ultimately be deemed illegal under international law. But we have seen that what has happened in the last couple of years is that the Israelis have almost systematically worked to try to weaken, if not destroy, a lot of the norms around the use of force, constantly challenging, weakening it. And that then paves the way for doing things like this without having the type of justifications that you may have needed 10 years ago. And there's an argument, I haven't looked into this enough to be able to make my own assessment, that there are elements in the US that are actually in favor of this weakening of the norms around the use of force because of the way it unties the US's hands in a future conflict with China.
For his part, Donald Trump seems fairly satisfied that the nuclear threat from Iran has been ended. He said that publicly in the last few days. You mentioned this pull and push between the midterm election and perhaps even Trump's MAGA base. Where will Donald Trump fall in this decision to get involved or not?
That is probably going to be the most decisive factor of all. And there's good reasons, in my view, for him not to be involved in this. I do not think that this is serving U.S. interests. I don't think the previous attacks that he is praising ultimately served U.S. interest either. I think it actually dramatically increased the chances, the risk of Iran actually going nuclear down the road. But what he does here is going to be absolutely decisive, because the Israelis cannot do this without the U.S. I mean, already now numbers are showing that the United States covered about 30 or 35% of Israel's entire military budget in 2024. The Israelis cannot do it without the U.S.'s air defense systems. It is not just the U.S. itself coming in, it's all of the missiles that the Israelis are using, all of it, for some of the systems at least coming from the U.S. What we have seen with Trump, that he has an ability to say no to the Israelis that frankly Joe Biden did not. But what we have not seen is an ability for him to sustain that no. People I've spoken to in the Trump administration say that the Israelis are relentless. They don't take no for an answer. They just keep on pushing, pushing, and pushing. And eventually they wear Trump down. If they do that again for the next war, one thing to understand with all of this is the next war is very likely not going to be like the previous war. It is not going to be a 12-day ordeal. It's not going to be something in which the U.S. can do a one-off and then walk away from. It is likely going to be a much larger war, a much bloodier war. And the reason I say this is because the Iranians, of course, fully understand that the Israelis are trying to turn them into Syria. For the Iranians to dispel them of that notion, they need to strike Israel much harder, much faster than they did in the previous war. In the previous war, they thought it was going to be a long war, and as a result, they paced themselves. They didn't use all of their missiles at once. There were many different factors as to why the barrages were not as large as they potentially could have been, but one of them was that they were playing the long game and they thought that they need to out-exhaust Israel. In the next war, I suspect that they will do the opposite. They will strike Israel very hard from the outset in order to make it as costly as possible for Israel, not only to continue that war, but to continue the entire strategy of mowing the grass, essentially giving up on it.
That last war ended, as you say, with a ceasefire that came after Donald Trump and the US weighed in. Is it clear who would win this time around if this conflict comes this year?
It is not, and I think it's very important to note that the previous war also was indecisive. The early predictions, of course, or the impressions, were that the Israelis were tremendously successful, because they were very successful in terms of taking out a lot of Iranian senior commanders. They killed a lot of scientists, their families and children, of course, which was not reported as much. But that was an initial success. After that, things started to change. And towards the end of the war, the Iranian penetration rate getting through the air defense system started to become alarmingly high, while the Israelis were running out of interceptors. The U.S. consumed about 25% of its entire stockpile of THAAD interceptors. That will take the U.S. about 3 to 5 years to replenish. So I think at the end of it, it ended up becoming indecisive. From the Israeli standpoint, I think 1 out of 3 objectives were achieved. They had 3 objectives: getting the U.S. into the war, decapitate the regime, turn Iran into Syria. The last 2 clearly failed. The first one was a partial success. They got the U.S. finally into a direct war with Iran. They had tried for more than 20 years, but it was just a one-off. What they were hoping for was that the U.S. would fully enter the war and bring the full force of America's military prowess into the calculation. And Trump said no to that. He did a one-off and then essentially pushed very hard to get a ceasefire.
Iran's regime is often described as vulnerable, particularly in the last few years, as we've seen protest movements and pressures on their economy. Did the war in June change that vulnerability at all?
I think the vulnerability is still absolutely there. This is not a popular regime, but what has happened is that the equation has now also included a different variable, which is that there is this massive wave of nationalism, which again was predictable. I have to admit, I didn't think it was going to be as strong as it was. I think part of the reason why it was this strong is because This happened in such a deceptive way. This happened 2 days before a new round of negotiations. This dispelled a lot of these notions that, oh, it's the Iranians that are wasting time, it's the Iranian government that is doing X, Y, and Z. Instead, we saw that there actually was a pretty elaborate deception going on, at least for a week, in order to lull Iran into a false sense of security and then attack when it had its guards down. And also, the manner in which the attacks were taking place. They were blowing up apartment buildings. There were a tremendous amount of collateral damage. To take out one senior military commander, the entire family and neighbors were killed. Moreover, targeting civilian scientists. We have to remember, the Iranian nuclear program, according to EU and US intelligence assessment, was still a civilian one. There had not been a decision to build a bomb. So the scientists that are working in that program are civilian scientists. Their names are registered with the IAEA. They were not only killed, they were killed together with their families and children. Doing things of that kind, quite naturally is going to have a very strong societal response. So what I think it has done, instead of getting people to get out on the streets and protest against the regime, which they have done numerous times already because it's not a popular regime, you actually saw the distance between society and government starting to lessen a bit, precisely because of this new threat that is a threat to both, not just to the regime, but to the society as a whole, because of the carelessness in which the Israelis were killing civilians and collateral damage. It was not reported that widely, but the Israelis themselves talked about it, that they blew off 5 car bombs in the middle of the day in Tehran. If the Iranians had done that in Israel, we would have rightly called that terrorism.
We've seen in recent days Iran's state media revealing that tens of thousands of people have been arrested as part of a crackdown after what Israel has claimed as intelligence penetration that led up to those attacks we're talking about. What do you make of these arrests? Could there really be that many spies?
I think, first of all, clearly the Mossad had managed to penetrate Iran in manners that was shocking to the system as a whole. And when you think about all of the different dual nationals that have been arrested over the course of the year, accused of spying, I think the picture is increasingly clear now that the Iranian intelligence services were focusing on entirely the wrong things, arresting a large number of innocent dual citizens who were just visiting families, whereas in reality there was a massive Mossad operation taking place inside of the country using completely different channels and ways. So that's one. Secondly, they seem to have gone on a strategy of better to cast a very, very wide net, arrest as many as possible, and then eventually release the ones that are not guilty, which is in and of itself a sign of desperation, the fact that they were completely taken by surprise. The question for the second war, of course, is, did Israel consume its cells inside of Iran in this first operation? Were these one-offs, things that they could use once, but after that these people either had to leave the country or were disposed of in other ways? Or is this a more permanent presence that they have in Iran? I don't think the Iranians fully have been able to answer that question. Also, if some reporting is true, which is that these cells actually were not largely in country, but rather they entered the country 3 days before the operations, that would also suggest that Israel may very well have the capacity of doing that again and make sure that in the next war, once again, they have a very significant presence inside the country.
Finally, one question that may also be unknowable. What would it take to avoid another Israel-Iran war?
I think what it ultimately takes is for the United States and Iran to reach a deal. That deal has to be one that is based on mutual compromise. If either side is going for capitulation, then it will not be achieved. That means that the U.S. Should, in my view, accept that there will be limited enrichment in Iran. That's the thing that will open up this issue. And then it is, frankly, up to the U.S. to put pressure on Israel not to restart this war. Israel will not be happy with any form of a deal between the U.S. and Iran. It was not happy with the JCPOA. It was not happy with what Trump was negotiating as well. So it's very clear. Israel does not want a deal. It doesn't matter what the details of the deal are. Israel wants the United States to go to war with Iran in order to establish a balance in the region that is far more favorable towards Israel, but one that Israel itself cannot achieve. Diplomacy is in the way of that objective.
Trita Parsi of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.